Good morning, everyone. Coming and assembling every Sunday, what I love about this is, and I've mentioned this before, but you come to the building as a preacher most days. Sometimes I work from home, and you realize the building's just not the church. It's when we come here and we assemble. This is the church. The church is the Lord's people, and we're reminded that we're in this together. We're not alone, and that was really clear to me this morning. Every Sunday, we make plans. Okay, we're going to wake up on time. We're going to, have our coffee. We're going to be getting ready at this time, and we're going to be out the door at this time. And that schedule always moves about 15 minutes slower than it should. And so we're always scrambling. It's always, a last-minute stretch, see if we're going to cross the finish line just in time. But I was relieved this morning when I pulled into the parking lot. It seemed like 80% of the congregation was just getting out of their cars. I was like, all right, we're in this together. We scrambled, but we all made it here. And this is the most important and hopefully the highlight of our week when we come and we remember our Savior. I found that song that David selected really moving, and I've sang it before, but it's been a while. But that question that it asks, were you there? And that's kind of a peculiar question because, of course, when that song was written, the answer is no. Literally speaking, none of us were there. But I'm guessing the intention of the author, as he moves through the phases of Jesus' crucifixion and ultimately him being buried in the tomb and when he finally arises from his tomb, and he keeps asking that question, were you there? It seems to me the intention is, on behalf of the author, is to say, we need to put ourselves there. Will you be there in your mind's eye for this moment? And the author of that song, that the result of that, it says it sometimes causes me to tremble, tremble, tremble. That is really the point of this sermon series that we've been going through as we look at the 7 sayings of Jesus. None of us were there that day. But as we come back to this now I think this will actually be the 8th lesson because we had an introductory lesson, but we come back to this scene 8 times. And all I'm asking you to do this morning, if you haven't been here for any of these lessons, or if you have been here for all 8, I'm asking you to be there. To stand before the cross of Jesus. Because I believe that when we all do that, everything in our life becomes smaller. We, in many ways, become smaller. Our pride should be diminished to nothing. Our envy and our focus on the material world should diminish and be smashed to smithereens. Our problems and our trials that we endure, they gain their proper perspective as we see Jesus enduring his greatest trial on our behalf. Everything is put in its proper place, including our own selves, when we stand before the cross of Jesus and really take time to meditate on the significance of this. This was a sermon series that had a profound impact on me. It was actually a sermon series that was taught that I heard during COVID. And just going back to that time, if there was ever a moment in my life, and I've had several moments, but if there's ever a moment on a national stage that I've been alive that said, you are not in control, it was 2020. We realized really quick that, number one, we're not able to control one another. And number two, we're not able to control the world around us. That there are so many things that factor into whatever our circumstances currently are. And it got really serious when it came to the NBA basketball season, and I think that they canceled the basketball season, and they're canceling college football, and you're going, man, things must be really bad in that case if they're canceling these sporting events. We stopped going to work. I imagine some people lost their jobs. Some people's social interactions that they depended on a week-to-week basis, all of a sudden that became nothing. Even coming here, worshiping God, something that we take for granted. It's just going to be there every week. It's going to be there Sunday mornings and Wednesday nights. All of a sudden, at least temporarily for most of us, that was also taken away. And we just realized how little control we actually have in this life that quickly, that instantly. But there's one thing that we remain in control of all along, and that is our response. And what was concerning to me during that time is we see how afraid of death the world really is. It's like this slavish fear that paralyzes and controls our every move. The question is that how we respond to trials or even, in worst case scenario, to death? I have had the privilege of seeing several Christians die. I say that it's a privilege, not a tragedy, because you see, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where you really begin to see the difference that faith makes in a person's life, contrasted with how the world handles such an occasion. I have some of these last words. Some of them, it's interesting. If you go on atheist forums, they'll say, no, that's made up. And of course, if you go to Christian forums, they'll say, yeah, no, this actually happened. And as I dug into the history of it a little bit, some of these, it's like, it's really been for a long time that these traditions have been held, that some of these famous atheists have had some of these famous last words. And so I'll let you do the research and decide for yourself whether or not these men actually said these things. But it is said that Sir Francis Newport, who was a head of an English atheist club, one of his last words, he said, "You need not tell me there is no God, for I know there is one, and that I am in his presence. You need not tell me there is no hell. I feel myself already slipping wretches. Cease your idle talk about there being hope for me. I know I am lost forever. Oh, that fire. Oh, the insufferable pangs of hell." Atheist David Hume, 1700s, his last words are said to have been, "I am in flames," and those with him said his desperation was a horrible scene. This one is, we know 100% certainty, this is what Steve Jobs said. You remember Steve Jobs, the inventor of the iPhone that makes all of our lives so much better and more enriched, doesn't it, in our children's lives? A man that was exceedingly wealthy and rich and probably experienced everything that there is to experience on this earth and on this side of life. It's said that his final words when his family was around were simply, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." Death is this incredible moment where it's almost as if you have your feet in two different worlds. You have one foot in this realm and the other foot in the next. And there's all sorts of strange stories, as we should probably suspect, as people are crossing that great chasm and going from this natural world into the supernatural world. And I wonder why he said, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." This morning we arrive at Jesus' last words. And they are so very different than probably just about anybody's words that we have ever heard said as they are finally breathing their last and knowingly doing so. Jesus' last words as he hung on the cross were, "Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit." Man has had his way with Jesus at this point on the cross for 6 hours. Really, when you begin to count it all up, they've really had their way with him for about 24 hours. When you consider the fact that they've arrested him, they kept him in prison overnight, they were mocking and beating him and saying all sorts of horrible things to him, and finally they deliver him to the cross, and they're continuing to say and do the same kind of things, mocking him with that crown of thorns. Mocking him with the sign that says, "Behold, the King of the Jews." And from a human perspective, again, it's as if man has just had their way with Jesus. But then God shows up in the final 3 hours of Jesus' life. He shows up in the form of this darkness that covered the land for 3 hours. Even while they were all mocking and sneering at him, surely that must have came to a halt as the supernatural event of darkness for 3 hours is hovering over this scene. And it's said that Jesus breathes his last at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Understand, this whole event is going on during Passover week, and it's said, and I've read, that at 3 p.m. they would offer their evening sacrifices. And they would indicate that they were doing so at the temple by blowing a ram's horn, and then the whole city would observe a moment of silence as that sacrifice was being made to commemorate the Passover. And it's at this time that Jesus breathes his last. When all of Israel is observing a moment of silence for their Passover lamb, Jesus lets this cry out and breathes his last words that he's entrusting and committing his spirit to God. Meanwhile, at the temple, what happens to the veil? The temple veil is torn in two. And so we read this in Luke chapter 23, in verse 44, where it says, "About the 6th hour there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And while the sun's light failed, the curtain of the temple was torn in two. And then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, 'Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.' And having said this, he breathed his last. Now when the centurion saw that what had taken place, he praised God, saying, 'Certainly this man was innocent.' And all the crowds that had assembled for this spectacle, when they saw that what had taken place, returned home beating their breasts. And all his acquaintances and the women who had followed him from Galilee stood at a distance, watching these things." Do you notice the shift? Do you notice the change in attitude of the centurion when all of a sudden, recognizing these things, he says, "This man was innocent"? And the crowds go from mocking and sneering at Jesus to beating their breasts over what had just occurred, seemingly interpreting it as a tragedy. And so this is an amazing saying. And I want us to recognize just three things, the way that Jesus handles this, the way that he endures his trial. And isn't that an amazing thing, that Jesus being God, even he had an amazing trial to go through in his life, as we all do. But we'll go through this and we'll see that, number one, Jesus cried to the Father. Secondly, Jesus, we see, relied on the Father to the very end, until finally the time came where he breathed his last and died for the Father. So you recognize that all the gospel accounts, there's two other accounts, Matthew and Mark, they all document, they don't necessarily have the words of Jesus, but they all document this one fact, and that is that Jesus cried out with a loud voice before he died. And Luke, even here, says that crying out with a loud voice, he said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When you look at that in the Greek, it comes from two words. The words translated crying out. It comes from the word megos, or mega is how we would use that now. And then phone. Megos, phone. And so literally this word is where we get our word for megaphone. And the point is that Jesus didn't have just like a quiet whisper to himself when he says these things. That somehow, even after 6 hours of being exhausted, of fighting death and holding it off as long as he can and fighting for every single breath that he could possibly muster, even in his last moment, he unimaginably releases this powerful cry that everybody could hear possibly at this moment of silence. And we're forced to ask, where does he muster his breath? How does he have the energy to do this? In either case, we see this wasn't a complaint, this wasn't a whine, but we see in the content of his words that this was a cry of trust, as we will see next. And he cries not for his disciples, not for his mother who was right there next to him on the cross, not for the Apostle John, who seemed to be the only one still present there, but his last cry, he is crying out to the Father, the only one who could possibly help him. I don't know about you, but I don't know if I would be crying out to God in this last moment after everything that God has allowed to happen to me. And keep in mind, none of this was deserved. All Jesus did was serve God his entire life and did so perfectly without sin. And now where has it led him? It's led him to suffer this horrible death where not only people do not appreciate what he has done and how he's used his life, but they are actually calling him a criminal for how he has lived his life and the things that he has said. And yet he still cries out to God. I'm mindful of myself. I often hesitate to cry to God. And I think a lot of us can relate to that. How many of us is it our first instinct to cry out to God, to take whatever burden it is that we are shouldering and to dump it on Him through prayer? Why do we do that? Again, are we saying that we don't want to burden Him? Are we suggesting that it's possible to actually overburden God? We can't do that. We know that. We don't want to overload Him. Don't worry, you can't. God is not like man. You see, anybody here in this room, if you go to them over and over and over again with their problems, I hate to admit this. We want to be there for everybody that we possibly can, but we find everybody that we go to, that we cry to, is ultimately human. And they can only shoulder so much. They're only capable of helping so much. But God is not like man. And so we must not hesitate to cry out to Him. In Psalm 34 and verse 17, it says, "The righteous cry, and the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles." In Luke 18, verse 7 through 8, remember that parable of the persistent widow. And the point that Jesus makes about that, as this woman is crying for justice day and night, He says, "Will not God bring about justice for His elect who cry to Him day and night? And will He delay long over them?" God doesn't get tired of hearing us. He wants us to cry to Him day and night. And Jesus says, "I tell you that He will bring about justice for them quickly." In Isaiah 65 and verse 24, it says, "It will also come to pass that before they call." How is it that He's already answering our prayers before we even call upon Him? Well, it's because God already knows the things that we need. And so in Isaiah it says, "Before they call, I will answer, and while they are still speaking, I will hear." And so we must not ever hesitate to cry out to God. As we see Jesus, He did not hesitate to do so even in the final moment of His life. Now, I want to remind us as we observe these things, it's tempting to interpret it as a horrible tragedy that's happening in Jesus' life. But we have to understand, if we're going to properly interpret the events that are taking place, is that Jesus isn't just being dragged along in all of this. Remember earlier, Jesus said, "I have authority to lay my life down. I have authority to take it up again." Jesus is in total control, despite how it looks, all throughout this scene. And I want you also to notice that when Jesus says these words, He's actually quoting Psalm 31 and verse 5. Which is a psalm of David, which is all about taking refuge in God no matter how difficult the situation may appear. Isn't it interesting? 3 different times on the cross, Jesus quotes Scripture. The other interesting thing about Psalm 31 is that this was probably a psalm Jesus had been quoting his whole life. Again, as I understand, when you look at the history of Judaism, when you look at Israel and Jerusalem, this was a psalm that they would say in the form of a prayer every night before they went to sleep, those who were devout Jews. Every night they are praying to God and they are saying, "Into your hands I entrust my spirit." Well, why would they say that before they go to sleep? Because there's no guarantee that we're going to wake up in the next morning, is there? We fall asleep and we take even that for granted, how little control we have as to whether or not we will wake up the next day. And so they pray to God before they put their head down on the pillow saying, "Father, into your hands I entrust my spirit." And here that's what Jesus is saying now. Because Jesus knows that this isn't the last time the world's going to see Him. And it's why later on in the New Testament, Paul describes death. He doesn't call it death anymore. He calls it to fall asleep. Because that is what death is for Christians, where we will one day breathe our last, we'll go into the grave, but there will be another day where we wake up and we arise from our graves the very way that Jesus did 3 days later after He died on the cross. And so let us listen to His words when we hear Jesus relying on the Father. And when He says, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." It's clear that Jesus is relying on the Father through and through, and this is no different or surprise from what we've seen throughout His life. And I want you to notice a few details that stand out. Just that word "Father." You know, Jesus isn't at odds with God. He's not shaking his fist at God as he is dying and suffering on the cross. But even now, he is calling out to him, Father, the way that a trusting son calls out to a father. And it's this word that indicates just the intimate relationship that he experienced all the way through his entire life. You know, Jesus uses this word 68 times throughout the Gospels. We see him using it on the Sermon on the Mount 17 times. In his final discourse, when he is preparing his apostles for what's about to take place, this is the night that he's betrayed, actually. He uses the word Father, referring to God, 45 times. That's amazing. In John 17, where he offers what we refer to as the high priestly prayer, this is his prayer that he's offering before he is arrested. He refers to God as Father 6 times. And now, not surprisingly, his very last words before he dies begins with him calling God Father. And so we see because of that, because he had this view of God as this Father that he could trust, we see Jesus doing just that. He's incredibly trusting towards the Father. You know, it's amazing. You look at this scene, and any one of us would stop trusting God up to this point. And yet we see Jesus all the way with his last breath continuing to trust God. And that is only because throughout his entire life, he lived in the presence of God. You know, you and I have that same promise. I love in 1 Peter 4 and verse 19 where it says, those also who suffer according to the will of God shall entrust their souls to a faithful Creator in doing what is right. Peter writes those words talking to a group of Christians who are suffering. And he's saying, just continue to do the will of God, and those of you who do, you are entrusting your souls to a faithful Creator. You know, the main lesson that we learn in life, again, is we have zero control often in our circumstances. But the one thing we always have control in is our response. I encourage you to turn over to Psalm 31. Let's turn over to Psalm 31. Again, this is the psalm that Jesus is quoting. And you'll notice that in verse 5 where he says, into your hand I commit my spirit. But then I want you to jump to verse 11. He says, to all my adversaries, I become a reproach, especially to my neighbors, and an object of dread to my acquaintances. Those who see me in the street flee from me. I have been forgotten like one who's dead. I've become like a broken vessel, for I hear the whispering of many. Terror on every side as they scheme together against me, and so they plot to take my life. He's saying, everything in my life is against me. But notice verse 14. But I trust in you, O Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hand. Rescue me from the hand of my enemies and from my persecutors. What is it Jesus earlier said? My God, why have you forsaken me? I love Judd's comments on the table this morning because so many of us approach faith in God like, God, I will trust you just as soon as you give me all of the answers that I'm seeking. And some of them are theological, but I got to be honest, a lot of them are just individual. Questions like, God, why are you letting this happen to me? What's your plan for my life? I don't see how this fits into your will. I don't see how this fits into your plan. God, why is this happening to me? But you know something? When we only listen to God, when he gives us the answers and makes things really clear as to why we're doing them, is that really trust? It's almost as though we're actually treating God with suspicion. You know, I look back at Eve in the garden. Isn't that really what was behind that first sin? I'm sure she had the questions that you and I have. Why did God make this tree and give this command to begin with? And all of a sudden, Satan sowed the seed of distrust and suspicion in the heart of Eve. She took and ate, and she regretted doing that from that day forward. We see Jesus saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we have these questions that we ask that we don't always get the answer to, but we trust in God anyways. Like the psalmist who recognizes everything is against him, but he says, listen, I just trust in you. I say, you are my God. That is what God wants. That no matter what happens, we say, you are my God. And sometimes what we have to say is what he says in verse 15. My times are in your hand. I don't know why I'm going through this, but I'm taking my times and I'm trusting you with it. I'm putting them in your hands. I'm putting myself and my circumstances into your hands, and I'm trusting you. And so we see because he had this intimate relationship with God, because he trusted God, we see that ultimately he surrendered to the will of God. That idea of committing his spirit or entrusting his spirit, it means to take something and to place it in front of another. In other words, it is a word that indicates a certain willingness. That you're taking something that is in your care and you're putting it in the care and charge of another. And that is what Jesus does while on the cross. And we see his disciples following it after these events take place. You remember Stephen in Acts chapter 7, verse 59. He seemed to have learned this lesson, probably hearing these words preached from people like Peter, hearing that these are what the last words of Jesus were, and as Stephen is getting ready to breathe his last, as he's being stoned to death by an angry mob, he says, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. He's saying, I'm entrusting my spirit to you. I got to say, I don't know if I have that level of trust. To trust him when it's become clear that things are not going to go my way in this particular scenario. And I actually find myself often vacillating in my trust in God. And this is indicated by my desire to take control. This is indicated by my willingness to turn to other things, to kind of maybe self-medicate, maybe turning to technology or something like that to cope with our anxiety and to give ourselves a sense of control. And we all do that from time to time. Because sometimes we're not sure if God will deliver us, if he really will take care of me, or if he even really cares at all. But as we struggle with those questions, we look at Jesus on the cross and we're reminded of why Jesus did these things and trusted the Father, even in this context. We're reminded that he did so for you and me. In John 6 and verse 39, this is the will of him who sent me, that of all that he has given me, I lose nothing, but raise it up on the last day. In John 10, verse 29, my Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. Everything that we're reading, everything that Jesus is going through, it is happening precisely because he cares for us and so that he can help us, so that he can save us from the ultimate tragedy that is death. And so now if we are living for God, not perfectly, but if we have dedicated our lives to him, we have the privilege to always have confidence. Doesn't mean we always will. But we can look at these things and have 1,000% confidence that God will help us. In 1 John chapter 5 and verse 14 through 15, he says, this is the confidence which we have before him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And if we know that he hears us in whatever we ask, we know that we have the requests which we have asked him. He's saying, look, as long as we're living according to the will of God, God is there. He wants to help his people. But that is only a promise for God's people. In 1 John 1, verses 5 through 6, it says, this is the message we have heard from him and announced to you, that God is light and in him is no darkness at all. If we say that we have fellowship with him and yet walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. That if I'm living in a way where I'm just constantly seeking to fulfill and gratify my own desire, my own will, what John is indicating is that we don't have fellowship. And therefore, God's help is not going to be available in my life. And so the question is, this comes down to a matter of trust. Who are we going to trust? Are we going to trust in God, or are we going to trust in something else? Again, Jesus quotes Psalm 31, verse 5. And it's peculiar, again, to me that in verse 6 he says, I hate those, of Psalm 31, this is the very next verse. He says, I hate those who devote themselves to worthless idols, but I trust in the Lord. You see, that's the temptation. That as David writes that psalm, that's the temptation. Will I keep trusting God? Or maybe he was tempted to trust in those gods as he was walking and fleeing to the world of the Philistines. And he was seeing how they handled their problems and the gods that they relied upon and the type of worship that they offered and their form of worship and the idols that they followed. That's the decision we're faced with. That's the choice. When I have no control and everything is stacked against me, that is still my choice. Am I going to trust God, or am I going to trust something else? Am I going to trust man? Am I going, again, to turn to something else to kind of self-medicate and take care of these feelings of anxiety that I'm dealing with? Technology, substance abuse, whatever it might be. Maybe it's the government. Maybe it's, counting on government to solve our issues and to give us a sense of inner peace. Is that how I'm going to deal with my problems? Or am I going to finally trust God? That's what Jesus did. And his problems weren't just solved right there on the cross. That what we realize as we get to the end of verse 46, it says, simply, having said this, Jesus died. And Matthew 27 and verse 50, I love how it words that. It says that he yielded up his spirit. Again, this was a willing decision on Jesus' part. Jesus did not yield to death and weakness, but I want you to see in this text that Jesus summons death like a chariot or a limousine to serve his purposes. It says that he died and he gave up his spirit, and then he breathed his last. And what the gospel authors are indicating to us is that this all the way through was a voluntary act on the side of Jesus. Augustine put it this way. He says of Jesus that he gave up his life because he willed it, when he willed it, and as he willed it. Admittedly, no other person has ever done that. None of us are able to face death with that level of control. You and I don't have a choice in how we die or when we die or where we die. But that makes what Jesus did all the more amazing. It wasn't an accident. It was intentional. And so we look at this, and when we realize that this was something that he was willingly doing, we again ask ourselves, who's in control here? Was Jesus murdered? Was this all just a horrible accident and tragedy? And we realize as we look at the words of the gospel writers when it says he gave up his spirit, he yielded his spirit, we realize Jesus wasn't simply murdered, but he was actually willingly offering himself as a sacrifice. He lived for God, and now he died for God. And he does so that he can show us both how to live for God and how to die for God. It's interesting that Psalm 31 verse 5, the words that Jesus leaves out are the words, "You have redeemed me, Lord God of truth." Maybe he left that out because it wasn't Jesus who was being redeemed on the cross, but it was you and me. And as we look at the cross, we're reminded that all of this happened according to the will of God for you and me. It was a choice that he made because he loved us. But it's not just something that we're to look at and marvel at, but what we're actually doing when we decide to follow Jesus is exactly what Jesus said, to pick up our cross daily and follow him. We realize we don't just stand before the cross in amazement and go, wow, I'm so glad that he did that. But what God's actually doing is offering us an example and a way of life. To love others, to put the interests and needs of others, to put the interests and will of God ahead of my own, even if it means that I suffer death. And so we look at these words, and Jesus says, into thy hands I entrust my spirit. We are appropriately going to sing Christ arose, because we realize that the cross isn't the end of the story of Jesus. That while it looks like Jesus was defeated that day, we realize that 3 days later, that Jesus trusted, and his trust was ultimately vindicated and justified when he rises from the grave triumphantly. That is the lesson that we take away from the cross. That if we trust God no matter what, no matter how dark and gray things appear, one day God will vindicate us and will show us that that decision was a worthwhile one. Let us stand and sing as we sing the song of invitation, Christ arose.
Lord.